Risk management process, nosedive case study. At the highest level, the risk management or ERM process needs to include the following activities. It starts with understanding the organizational context, developing a risk management strategy, then identifying risks, assessing and evaluating those risks, including quantitative and qualitative analysis, prioritizing those risks, developing and implementing risk response strategy and effective treatments, monitoring effectiveness and seeking assurance, and communicating and reporting. As mentioned before, to understand most of the key elements of the above process, we will follow the guidance provided in COSO ERM and especially Component 3, covering principles 10 to 14 loosely. And a couple of very important points to keep in mind before we start our discussion. One is that the above activities are just one way of describing the ERM process. And two, all of these activities are iterative, meaning they do not happen in a linear fashion, one after another, but rather they inform and affect each other, as we have discussed before in previous lessons. We will go through the above iterative activities with the help of a simple case study based on our fictional organization Nosedive. You may want to download the case study documents from the lesson resources before moving ahead with this lesson. The documents are: number 1, ERM, Nosedive case study; 2, risk register template; and 3, case study support doc. We will discuss the use of all 3 docs while we are going through the above activities. Okay, let's go. Understanding the organizational context and objectives. When establishing a strategy to support its purpose, vision, and core values, an organization examines business context. Business context refers to trends, relations, and other elements influencing the present and future business strategy and objectives of a firm. It may be dynamic. That is, new risks emerge anytime, disturbing the status quo at any point. For example, a sudden trend in customer taste or a sudden change in customer taste makes the current product practically obsolete. Number 2, complex and multi-connected. For example, a company has multiple plants or locations worldwide, each with its own political systems, policy and tax laws, and regulatory matters. And number 3, unpredictable. Change can take place swiftly and unexpectedly. Example, currency fluctuations or weather or political changes. In case study section industry profile, you will see a small example of understanding context where we have explained the industry context of the auto industry or auto parts industry. Understanding context also include considering external environment and stakeholders, including external stakeholders such as regulatory authorities or a customer body outside the entity that can influence the entity's ability to achieve its objectives. A number of external factors can be characterized by the PESTEL acronym, that is, political, economic, social, technical, legal, and environmental. Then you move on to considering internal environment and stakeholders. The internal environment of an entity is anything inside that can affect its ability to achieve its strategy and corporate goals. Internal stakeholders are the people that work in the organization, such as board of directors, management, and employees. Board of directors do not work in the organization, but they are directly related. Because the size and structure of the companies varies widely, internal stakeholders may affect the organization as a whole differently then how it affects different parts like a division, an operating unit, or a function. As we discussed, the business context is something which is dynamic, complex, and unpredictable. Hence, the board and management keep close tabs on factors that materially affect it. Developing a risk management strategy. Risk management strategy involves articulating the framework, policy, procedures, and mechanisms as to how an organization is planning to manage or tackle its risk. A section in the case study, named Nosedive's Risk Management Framework, gives you a glimpse of how an organization can define its risk management strategy. Again, it's a glimpse. It just gives you one way of doing things in a small way. Identifying risk or identifying risk. The organization's strategies and business objectives are met by new risks, as we have seen all along, all the time, that arise and change. So, it undertakes risk identification actions to first determine the risk inventory. What are the risks that are possibly going to affect the organization? And then confirm the applicability and relevance of existing risks. With the progressive integration of risk management practices, risk knowledge and awareness are kept current through regular everyday operation. Sometimes these activities are repeated to confirm the completeness of the risk inventory. How often? That depends on how quickly risks change or new risks arise. When risks may take months or years to materialize, the frequency of identifying a risk will be less than when the risks are less predictable or occur more quickly. So after you understand the context, you develop a risk management strategy, and the first thing you do is to identify the risks which might affect the organization. There are a variety of risk identification approaches available. As part of daily activities such as budgeting, business planning, performance reviews, and meetings, considerations in new products and design approvals, and customer complaints, incidents, or financial losses. So when you are performing all of these activities, you are also identifying things which can defer them, which can affect them. So that is also part of the risk identification process. Additional targeted activities like simple questionnaires, facilitated workshops, and interviews can be supplemented by identification activities integrated throughout the entity. Some techniques such as data tracking and complex analytics can also enable certain approaches. An organization examines how changes in the assumptions underlying the strategy and business goals may cause new or emerging risks, regardless of approaches selected. In one case, for example, management assumed an interest rate lower than 5% for the next foreseeable future for the loan to be obtained for working capital. But the actual interest rate got increased to more than 7%, creating a new risk of fulfilling overall profitability objectives. So management also needs to take the business environment into account and the changing circumstances, including the expected economic outlook for the changing preferences of customers and expected growth rates for risk identification. So risk identification is not static. It will continue and it will improve itself in an iterative fashion. Review the risk identification section in the case study and try to identify additional risks, additional to what we have already mentioned in the case study. Then we move to assessing and evaluating the risks that we have identified. And this includes quantitative and qualitative analysis. In order to understand the severity of the risks, how severely they will affect the strategy and business goals of the company, the risks need to be assessed. Because those risk evaluations or assessment then inform what kind of response or what types of response would be deployed or selected. Due to the seriousness of the identified risks, management will determine the resources and capacity to use in order to keep the risk within the risk appetite of the company. In accordance with the business objectives it may affect, the severity of a risk is assessed at various levels. So some risk might be less severe at a lower level but become more severe at a higher level, or vice versa. For example, a risk at the level of a division or entity assessed to be more significant than at the level of an operating unit. At higher levels of the company, risks can affect reputation, brand name, and confidence. So they are seemingly more severe. The use of standardized risk terminology and categories helps effective risk assessment at all organizational levels. It's very, very important. So risks can be grouped together between business units, divisions, and functions. For instance, the risk of technological breakdowns identified by several divisions can be grouped and collectively evaluated, and that will also define the severity at the entity level. Likewise, the risks measured in an entity may also be combined at escalating levels, how quickly they can escalate. The risk rating or score may change if common risks are grouped. So if you have 3 or 4 medium or low level risks, but they are very similar and you combine them, then obviously that combined risk would logically be a higher rating risk. If considered collectively across the business units or divisions, risk of a low severity individually can become more or less critical. As we discussed earlier, the most common measures to assess the exposure or risk rating are impact and likelihood. So impact, let's refresh, is the risk outcome or consequence. That is, a series of possible risk-related impacts can occur and it can be positive or negative. Usually the highest rated impact is selected to be included in rating calculation. For example, if there are 2 possible impacts of a risk, such as financial and reputational, then the one with a higher rating will be selected for consideration to actually become part of the rating of that overall risk. Have a look at the impact categories in case study support doc and you will know what I mean. The other measure is likelihood. That is the possibility of a risk occurring. Now please review likelihood in the lesson relevant risk terms for more context about the quantitative and qualitative and frequential descriptions of likelihood. Please also review the suggested likelihood categories and levels in the case study support doc. While assessing risk, you have to keep in mind the inherent target residual and actual residual risk, explained in the lesson relevant risk terms. You should ideally assess a risk score or risk rating for each risk that is inherent, target residual, and actual residual, because that will tell you how adequate the existing controls are in preventing and mitigating the risk, as well as what do you need to do in addition to existing controls in terms of responding to that risk. Now you're ready to try and complete the risk assessment in the risk register template. Once you have completed the likelihood and impact ratings, you will see that the third sheet in the template, the risk heat map, will get populated. And that is the most commonly used representation of a risk profile, among many others. Now, once you have all the risks identified and assessed and evaluated and scored, you then need to prioritize which one you want to tackle more or first and which one later or less. Obviously, the most important reason for prioritizing risk is as a basis for selecting responses. We have discussed some of the most pertinent risk prioritization criteria in the lesson relevant risk terms. It can happen that risks with similar assessments of severity may be prioritized differently. That is, 2 risks may both be assessed as medium, but management may give one more priority. For example, Nosedive identified that its supply chain risk as high with a risk score of 15 and its human resource turnover risk also high, that is employee leaving also high, with a risk score of 15. But Nosedive decides to prioritize HR risk above the supply chain risk due to other factors such as employee dissatisfaction or a threat of a strike. And risk appetite also plays an important role in risk prioritization. For example, board of Nosedive is very concerned about the negative publicity of a strike. Hence, it instructs management to prioritize avoiding an employee strike as compared to a supply chain disruption.